Welcome to the Advantage Podcast, a monthly unscripted conversation with host David Ashcraft and top leaders impacting our world. Created by pastors for pastors to strengthen our leadership and expand our knowledge and influence.
Hey, well, I am here with Dave Ferguson. Dave, thank you for being willing to spend some time with the Advantage pastors and pastors in Pennsylvania. Appreciate it very much.
Oh, thanks for having me. You were updating me earlier about the work and the expansion that's happened there, and it's very, very exciting. So thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, David. Yeah, it is exciting what God is doing. And what we keep saying all the time is God has placed each of us in a specific community, a specific region in Pennsylvania. If all of us can be better at leading our churches and introducing more people to Jesus, and everybody wins. So we're excited about what's happening. So, Dave, tell us real quick. I know we formally introduced you already, but maybe tell us a little bit of your story. And I will just say real quick, my first encounter with you was probably back in 2002 or three or four. We were just starting to explore the idea of multi-sites, and you guys were doing a conference here at Community Christian Church. It's not even a conference; it was more of a workshop, I think. And we came up. There were four of us that came up for several days, and you helped us kind of outline what it looks like to try to go multi-sites. So appreciate that very much. You've had a big impact on us.
Well, you are a great example of somebody who took our ideas and did it far better than we ever did. So nicely done.
Well, thank you for the help in the start. But tell us a little bit about your background then.
Sure. We go. Maybe I'll begin with the end in mind. I'm currently wearing three hats, but it started. I was about 25 years old out of college, and myself, my brother, and a few friends from college all started a church here in Chicago called Community Christian Church. And we now have locations across the city and suburbs. And it's been a blast for over 30 years now, just doing that. Out of that, we had this vision for being what we called a reproducing church. And really, even we had kind of a threefold vision. We wanted to be an impact church, a reproducing church, and then we used to, like, a third part was like, if God would really bless it, we'd love to be a movement, because that's how we understood the New Testament, as church was a movement. Yeah. And so we started planting churches, and we planted our first one out in Colorado, and then eventually the next year in Southern California, and then outside of Detroit, and then New York and Boston and Knoxville. And we've kind of just kept planting churches, and we called that New Thing. Last year, we got to help plant over 11,000 churches in 39 countries, and that was a blast. And then along the way, being very gung-ho about all things multiplication and church planting, a buddy of mine named Todd Wilson, we kind of took over this small little church planting conference called the National New Church Conference. And we thought it was just for a year, but then we decided to do it a second year. And then the third year, we renamed it Exponential, and every year it just kept growing. And so now, in addition to being the lead pastor at Community and also the lead visionary for New Thing, I'm the CEO at Exponential. And we have a large conference, several other things that we do in Orlando, and feel very, very, very fortunate to get to do the things that I do.
Yeah, well, you've got a lot on your plate, and so thank you for even taking time with us today. I'm actually here with Dave at Community Christian Church in Naperville, and so fun to be here and see what you guys are doing specifically at this location. But just the impact that you guys have made, continue to make around the world and in the United States is huge. Exponential, I'm imagining most of you guys have heard of Exponential. Many of our guys have probably been to Exponential, and I had the opportunity for the first time in a long time to participate last year. We'll have opportunity again to go this year. That's in March, right? Coming up
You got it.
third week of March. And you said it's been sold out since August. So you're not lacking for people to attend, which is great.
No, it does it in a weird way. And you know what this is kind of like too. There's some things you work really hard at and they go well. And then there's some things you work really hard at and they just exceed your expectations. It feels like God's favors on it. And
Yeah.
super grateful for that.
Yeah, definitely so. Well, that's great. Hey, you're also in the middle of a transition right now, right? So so that's a big one. So you're wearing three hats right now, but soon to be down to two.
That's the goal.
Yeah. Okay, good. And so how is that? We talking about that transition? Is that okay to talk about?
Oh
And
yeah,
how's that going? So
absolutely.
that's the church
Yeah.
knows, right? So it's a
Yeah, I've been the lead pastor here at Community for almost over 35 years. And so about 18 months ago, we publicly went public. Before that, I had lots of conversations with Ted Canaris. Ted is a guy who joined our staff team as a leadership resident about 8 years ago. Planted a brand new location. It did really well. We actually then put him in charge of all of our locations, and he did a great job with that. Then we put him in charge of all of our expressions. And then after that, we asked him to join our lead team. And then about 2 years ago, I came to him and said, "Hey, I think I'd love for you to start praying and thinking about being the next lead pastor." And so we've had an 18-month, what we call lead pastor apprenticeship. One of the things we really value at Community is apprenticeship, and that, every leader needs to have an apprentice. You need to be developing and multiplying other leaders. And it felt like just a great opportunity to, one more time, teach the church that, every leader has an apprentice, even the lead pastor. And so we've been going through that, what we call a 5-step process, over the last 18 months. And that'll culminate May 1st, where I'll hand the baton to him and I will get out of his way. And for me, that means spending a lot more time now with New Thing and also leading Exponential.
Yeah, very cool. Good. Well, wish you well and God's blessings on you in this transition. It sounds like it's been going really well so far. And so in the days ahead, it's exciting for both Community Christian, but for you as well as you get to focus more on Exponential and New Things. That's great.
Yeah, thanks.
I've thoroughly enjoyed getting to have several conversations with Dave over the last couple of years, and very much just appreciate him and his focus on multiplication. So I'd love Dave to, I guess, zero in a little bit more on the concept of multiplication. And let me back up a step just in the history of your church. So when you first started, was multi-site the first thing that you were doing as you were reproducing then? So first you guys were single site, then you went multi-site, then you started planting churches. Is that the progression? Did I hear that
Um,
right?
we actually we started planting churches and went multi-site about the same time.
Oh, did you? Okay.
Yeah. So it
And
was almost in parallel.
okay, all right. And remind me on your multi-sites now, because I know one of the things you guys, I think, popularized was just the big idea when it came to teaching messages. And so do you guys still do that now? Do you get together, come up with a big idea, and then it's taught live at the different locations?
Yeah, actually, the big idea is something that kind of preceded even multi-site, but we kind of had to really fine tune it and operationalize it when we went multi-site. So basically, the concept is that, yeah, every week there's one big idea that we teach our people. What is the one thing that we want people, either to think or feel or do, and sometimes a combination of those things in following Jesus. And we will do everything we possibly can, whether it's, through the worship or through some kind of the arts and also the teaching. How do we communicate that one big idea?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. And then real quickly, I think you told me your dad was a pastor.
Yes, he was. Yep.
I grew up in a pastor's home. Okay. And where did you go to school?
My undergrad was from Lincoln Christian College, and then
Where
seminary.
is that?
It's actually in Lincoln, Illinois, small little town in the middle of central Illinois. And then grad school was at Wheaton Grad School.
Okay. Okay. Very good. Yeah. Great. So let's talk a little bit about multiplication if we can. And just to
Yeah.
kind of set up the conversation, Dave, and you and I have talked about this, so this is no surprise to you. I, early days at LCBC would say, we're not ever going to plant churches. And my reason for it is just because of what I felt like was a high failure rate. I felt like it was more personality driven. And if you had the right leader, it's going to go well. If you didn't, it's not going to go well. And so I was always real, I guess I should say against it if I'm honest, and not definitely not a proponent of it. And then as we reached a place where we couldn't grow anymore in our location, our one location, we started looking around the country, saw this thing called multi-site popping up, and so we jumped into that and felt like we could do that, and that's worked well for us. And so I've had this real strong bias towards multi-sites and maybe sometimes almost antagonistic towards church planting. And so I would love in this conversation just to talk a little bit about you're doing both. And so, first of all, how did you get comfortable doing both? Was it even an issue for you? And what are the pros and what are the cons of each one? Can we talk about that maybe first? And I would say a lot of our churches are either they're all thinking about multiplying. And so they're thinking about church planting, they're thinking about multi site, but maybe pros and cons that you see in each model.
Yeah. I'll tell you what, and we were joking a little bit beforehand that we'll be okay fighting about this a little bit. So go back to what were the pros you said of multi-site versus
Well, for
church planting?
me, yeah,
Yeah.
for me, and again, I understand I've got biases, Dave. So
Oh
for
yeah.
me,
Well,
it's
and clearly I do.
so for me, it's not so much built around personality as it is a replicable model. And if we've got a model that's working well and we can replicate that in another setting, then we continue there. And it still takes personality, but that's not the driving factor. And so I felt like that's a safer, to me, more proven, though it's a newer thing, so probably you could argue it's not as proven, but it feels like there's a success rate is much higher. Where my concern on church planting is it's more personality driven, or at least to my mind, that's what's going to cause it to be successful is if you've got the right personality. If not, it's going to fail. And the number, and so you may even refute this, the number I'd always hear is 4 out of 5. Both businesses and 4 out of 5 new church plants are going to fail, and so that's some of my logic and bias against church planting and pros for multi-site.
Yeah, very good. Wow, wow, wow. This is so awesome. Where do you start? Um, One, I would probably push back on those stats. I think you're right about new businesses, 4 out of 5. I'm not sure that's been consistent with church plants, but it also, from the data that I've seen on church plants, but it also kind of depends on kind of what kind of church plant you're talking about too.
Sure. Yeah.
So let me back up a little bit. I think part of my bias, and I hate to pull the Bible on this, uh, but what I
Right.
see in the New Testament, I think was Jesus' vision for the church was a movement. I mean, I think I think when you look at Acts 1:8, I mean, it's Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, ends of the earth. I mean, he's saying we're going to start this thing here and we're going to scale this thing. We're going to go global. That's he's talking to 12 guys. And he said,
Yeah.
this is here's the big dream.
Yeah.
And in some ways too, I'll also kind of go back to 2 Timothy 2 too. And I kind of feel like if Jesus was the visionary, Paul was like the integrator, and Paul was saying, okay, Timothy, here's how we're going to get this done. Jesus got this big dream, and he talked about those 4 generations of multiplication in there. Here's how we're going to actually get it done. I think one of the things, and maybe it's a bias, we can talk about this. I think maybe the bias that you might bring to it might be a North American bias because you're talking about a particular type of church. You're talking about um, what we is often referred to as kind of the prevailing model in the United States. In order to have the prevailing model, there are a lot of the things you talked about. I think are true that you do need those. If you're talking about launching with, let's say more than 200 people and then growing from there, you need to have that. I would also argue, though, you need that in multi-site as well, because I have a hunch that at LCBC, all of your sites will probably launch with more than 200 people, and either you or your campus pastor was maybe the driving personality that actually made that successful, and God used that in a very, very good way. And so part of the problem, I think, with us, it's to a certain extent saying that multi-site is better than church planting is because we've only got one paradigm of what church planting is, and that is we're going to spend $250,000, we're going to spend $1 million, and we're going to launch something with more than 250 people. Well, in the places where that's happening in the world, which is mostly in the West, is where the church is also declining the fastest. So I think in some ways, and this may get to a bigger conversation, we really need to reevaluate our paradigm of church.
Hmm. Yeah.
And in reevaluating our paradigm of church, I think then what we'll find is where the places where the church is and the gospel is spreading the fastest, and we actually do see movemental forms, are where a lot of the folks that are pastors are lay people. A lot of the folks, I mean, it's a much smaller, more rapidly multiplying kind of expression of church. So I would challenge, and again, everybody listening, ask the question of what is your simplest form of ecclesiology? What's your simplest form of ecclesiology? And I'll throw out mine, and you
Yeah, I
can,
was gonna say share yours
yeah, and then
yeah,
you can, and let's debate this and see what you
yeah.
think. Now, LCBC, are you guys like is that a totally independent church, or you're
Yeah, we're
part of?
totally independent. We've got an elder board of 8, 9 counting the senior pastor as well. And
But
yes,
you're
but
not a part of a denomination.
no.
Did you found LCBC?
It was about 3 years old when I stepped in, about 150 people and 3 years old.
It's almost essential you did then, really. Yeah. Okay. Um, I would say this. I'd say when you have a community of people who are on mission together, where Jesus is Lord, I would call that a church.
Okay.
If you had a community of people, and again, that's my minimal form of ecclesiology. There's lots of things you could add to that, and I kind of, when I say Jesus is Lord, you're packing a lot of things, you're kind of sneaking a lot of things in there. But
Right.
community of people on mission together, where Jesus is Lord, I'd say, yeah, you know what? I would say, yeah, that you could have a church there.
And on
Um,
mission together, break that down a little bit more. Is that reaching more people for Christ? Is that discipleship? Or it could be a number of things, I suppose.
I would say if the community of people, that's about what's going on with us on mission together. But I think that a church doesn't exist only for themselves; they exist for the world.
Right.
And we could create some uh, categories there. But and when you say disciple making, I would include discipleship. I would include evangelism in that. When
Okay.
you say disciple making, I would include issues around restorative justice in that as
Okay.
well. So
Okay.
I would include all that in the Jesus mission.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
community of people on mission together, where Jesus is Lord. I think you have a church.
Yeah. And I would agree with that. I'm good with that. So,
Okay. And
yeah.
I think, and so I think for us, I think the question is, how do we actually restore the movemental form that Jesus intended for his church? And honest to goodness, I mean, you look around, I love, like, I don't know, what do we got? 60,000 square feet here at we call it the Yellow Box, one of our locations, a 1,100 seat auditorium. It is awesome, but this is not a movemental form.
Yeah. But the only place I'd argue, Dave, would be
Yeah.
so I remember for years,
Yep.
the Lancaster newspaper about every 2 years would come out, and it isn't even just the Lancaster newspaper. It's in Barna. It's all kinds of people that are constantly saying large churches are dead. Large churches are dead. And what the newspaper in Lancaster, they would report on 7 or 8 house churches that popped up in Lancaster, and they say that's the new wave. Look at all these house churches that are coming up. And I go, yeah, that's great that they're doing that. But in those 6 or 7 or 10 house churches, there's maybe 100 people. Where in a larger church, there's 1,000 or 2,000 or 20,000. So I could probably, I guess, then would have to define what a movement is, because you could
Right.
have a movement just in one church if enough people are there, possibly. I guess it depends on the definition of movement.
Yeah, and I've been on the receiving end of those kind of critiques as well, and I think they're partially right, but they're also partially wrong. And
Yeah,
and here's where I would say I think what we need to enter into is I think we need to enter into a both and thinking, not an either or.
yes, I
And
agree.
so I think there's some people like a David Ashcraft who ought to grow a large multi-site church and just crush it for Jesus. I mean, be awesome because the kind of leadership gifts he's given you, the kind of communication skills he's given you, the stunning good looks that he's giving you. I mean, you need to be in front of you need to
Exactly,
you
exactly.
need to be in front of lots of no, I mean, like Andy Stanley. Andy Stanley needs to be in front of thousands of people. Okay. And communicating. Craig Rochelle, same thing. He needs to be, and he ought to be able to use those gifts. So I think you want every person using their gifts. I would say at the same time, though, and I know this is true for me as a young church planter, there was a certain way I thought things ought to be done. Was I right? Probably 90% of the time, 90% of it, not necessarily. Maybe 10%, I had some things I really wanted to try. It was nice enough, kind of, that someone gave me permission to do it. So what I want to do is, yes, I would, and we're talking about, okay, where's our next location of Community Christian Church going to be? But at the same time, we're also talking about where the next 10 church plants going to be. Because
Mhm.
I think there's some people that are wired and gifted with kind of the unique apostolic kind of gifting to start something brand new. And some people, like Rick Bole, Rick's a guy in my small group. He loves um, kids with special needs, and he's served with Young Life's division of Capernaum for years. He actually came to an Exponential Central conference here in this building 2 years ago. At the end of the conference, James Meeks is speaking. You know James?
I do. Yeah.
Okay. So James Meeks is speaking, and he's like, you know what? If you're going to plant a church, you don't need resources. You just need to be available. You don't need money. You just need to be available. You don't need, a seminary degree. You just need to be available. And so Rick, my buddy in my small group, okay, is taking all this in. He's been a real successful salesman. And he leans over and he's like, hey, I'm available. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And then he's like, could I, later on we're talking, could I start a church to reach people and their families who have special needs? And I was like, I don't know, let's go for it. Well, we gave him some minimal training through what we do. And several months later, then he launched a church where on his first Sunday, they had 115 people. And it was all families who have somebody in their family who has special needs. And they meet every Sunday at 6 p.m. I think we need to give permission to those people. They don't it doesn't have to be a site. It doesn't have, or we got another woman in our church, Shelly. Shelly just started volunteering because she was trying to find a place to serve at a local seniors community. And not at all glamorous, but one of the things she was doing, she was actually cleaning wheelchairs. And she heard a similar kind of message like this, kind of the bloom where you're planted kind of thing. And she was like, you know what? I wonder if I could start something here at this senior community. These people, I mean, they have almost nobody. And, she was building relationship because she was in proximity and cleaning some of the things. And now she started something there. Now, neither one of those people ever get paid, but I would say they're leading something that's a community of people on mission together with Jesus is Lord. And I think we need all kinds of people starting all kinds of things. Now, I'll say one more thing and then you can push back. I think we do need to, with humility, learn from our brothers and sisters in Africa and Asia, where a lot of the church looks a lot like what I just described. They're smaller expressions led by volunteer people where, it may be 50 to 75 folks or less in some cases.
Yeah.
I mean, they're doing some things right that we're not doing. I would suggest, we'll get a little more technical, in the Western context, and this comes originally from Tim Keller, that maybe one of the things that the institutional, and I'll use that not very nice term for like LCBC and Community Christian Church, the institutional church ought to be thinking about is how do we allow these other alternative expressions to start, but for them to still be able to be closely connected to the institutional churches, because a lot of their kids would still like to go to summer camps. And a lot of they would still like to show up when we have a program on marriages and that kind of stuff that they are not going to be able to do. And so I would encourage church leaders, think in terms of both. Yes, if you have the gifting and organizational skills to start a multi-site church that continues to grow, do that. But at the same time, how do you also give permission to every person without being afraid, without being intimidated, like they might take some of ours, give them permission to go start a brand new expression, a brand new church somewhere.
Yeah. And so part of what
there's my rant.
Yeah, no, that's all right. So part of what you're saying, Dave, is in your mind, the whole idea of church planting is in some ways giving people permission to act on either an impulse or a nudge from God to start something new. And you free them, you maybe give them training, but it's not necessarily that community Christian is saying, okay, we're going to go plant a church. It's probably a combination of both, but you probably do that some. But some of it is just here's somebody that's got this idea, this desire. You give them some training, some backing, some way to go. We'll encourage you, but it's not necessarily a formal situation of let's go out and plant and let's put X number of dollars into it, things like that. Though you probably have that model too, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a number of different things. So we do have locations, and if you're a community Christian church location, probably similar to LCBC, we have what we call our 10 campus constants. Here's the 10 things that we all do, and you're very clear about that. We also, have new things. So we're planting all these churches all over the world to do new thing, and basically, there's only a handful of things that are, and probably it's around Jesus and multiplying that we all are on the same page about. A lot of different expressions. The two examples I gave you with Rick and Shelly, I mean, neither one of them have our logo on it or anything, but we are cheering for them and we love
Yeah.
it.
Well, and as I'm listening to you talk, you and I probably aren't that far off even on these concepts. And the idea of multiplying, I'm all for. I'm just looking for what's the most what are the I don't want to use the word odds. How do we improve the odds that it's going to be successful? And I guess again that probably comes down to the definition of what successful even is. But for LCBC, we probably have 15 of our locations, maybe a few more, that are the formal. Let's send people out. Let's start a location. And more recently, over the last several years, we've got 5 or 6 or 7 locations that started in a home someplace differently. They were using LCBC just to watch for the content, and they've grown to 150
Wow.
people. And so, in a way, that's almost church planting because we didn't go out purposefully and do that. But when we see them working, we cultivate and try to encourage and things like that. Yeah. So, and then what we're also seeing, Dave, is our campus is beginning to multiply themselves. And so now campuses that were one offs from our main campus are now starting their own sites. And so it's exciting to see that. So I think multiplying can happen both ways. So
Let me ask you this then. Okay, so you got to 15 locations, and then you got, this 27-year-old, and I'm sure this has never happened, staff member who is slightly too cocky, like probably I was when I planted a church, and they're going like, "Hey, I love LCBC, but you know what? I got this other thing I want to do. Would you guys get behind that? Because I'd like to do my own thing."
yeah, we have not yet done that. I mean, we've encouraged them as they go out to other settings, but we haven't necessarily gotten behind it and said, a mile down the street from us, we'll give you money to get that thing going. We haven't done that. So,
And I think that's where, and again, there's sometimes if it's a mile down the street that might not make sense. But I do think we have to move in the direction of how do we really help evaluate what everybody's gifts are, and some people's gifts, because there's some people that should be church planners and they should not be your campus pastors.
right, right.
Because candidly, I think we can say this, and we got all pastors listening, they're going to be kind of a pain in the butt to you.
Yeah, yeah,
Right. And it might be if you send them out there, kind of like your kids, and they get started, they're going to take a few knocks, but along the way, they're going to figure this thing out. And eventually they're going to really do a good job. And so we've kind of chosen to go like, hey, we're going to try to, as much as we can, lead with a yes. And ahead of time, you tell us which path you want to go. Do you want to plant a church or do you want to start a site? We'd like to try to make that happen.
yeah. And, the other form of multiplying, really what we're doing with the advantage is a form of multiplying not necessarily LCBC, but just saying, how can we, all of us, pour energy into pastors around the state of Pennsylvania so that we can all be better in our specific locales or neighborhoods and communities? And in a way, that's multiplying all of us together, working on a multiplying effect so that we're stronger that way. So, Dave, if you were going to, again, we've got churches, pastors are trying to figure out how do they multiply.
Yeah.
If you were going to say, you should do multi-site, you should do church planting, or do you wait? Would you have advice to give, or would you want to talk to that person, find out their gifting, their strengths? How would you direct somebody in that regard?
So let's say one of the people listening, they're leading a church and they're coming to us and go like, yeah, hey, I want to multiply. What would I say to them?
Yeah,
Um, I would probably back up even further, and I would say, um, I would start with multiplying leaders, and maybe even just multiplying disciples, because I think what I've found is if you get that part of the flywheel going, multiplying disciples, and then multiplying leaders. And when I use the word leader, I'm talking about maybe it's a missional community, maybe it's a small group, some sort like that. If you get those two things going, pretty soon you will multiply at every level,
yeah,
and you'll almost have to intentionally stop it. You will start multiplying sites. You'll start multiplying probably churches as well. That's been my experience. So if anybody who's going like, yeah, I want to see a movement. I think it starts where Jesus started with, hey, okay, you guys, let's go. And we're going to go and make disciples. And how do we, in fact, the book that I got a chance to write called Hero Maker is all about, here's what we call the 5 essential practices of leaders that multiply other leaders. And we go through that, and it's based on some research that we did at Exponential, and it gives you both a practice, 5 different practices, and then a simple tool with each of those practices so that you can actually go ahead and do it. And but the overall mindset of the idea of a hero maker is that the focus isn't on me, that actually I'm trying to make heroes of other people.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I know, Dave, I mean, we will internally at LCBC talk about, what's the best way if you're going to do multi-site? Is it video teaching? Is it live teaching? What I see a lot of times happen, even the multi-site, is everybody wants to do live teaching exclusively. What oftentimes happens is they end up spinning off some of those campuses. But I look at that and go, that's a great way to plant churches, though. And so it's not a bad thing ultimately if those churches can continue to thrive and move forward. So yeah, so I mean, bottom line, there's I think multiple ways to multiply. It's just making sure that we're not just set in our own ways and our own little territories and not expanding at all. So
Oh yeah, and we talk about it this way at Exponential. It's not about my castle; it's about God's kingdom.
yeah, that's good.
And if you're keeping that first and foremost, and you're leading with a yes to anything that's going to expand God's kingdom and not just your castle, then yeah, we're going to be all good.
So in your mind, which one is harder, multi-site or church planting, or they're
Uh,
different
um,
things?
it's different. That's a great question.
They're so
Okay.
different. It's probably hard to say, huh?
It is. Well, no, 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 it's a great. I love this question. I think it's harder to plant the initial church. Um, but I think what I once would have said, where I think you get all the economies of scale with multi-site, I think there's eventually a lot more complexity with multi-site, which makes it challenging. And you need a different kind of leader. And so, like, if you came to me, let's say someone's listening and said, you know what, before I'm dead and it's all but dead and done, I want to impact. I want to see 100,000 people become followers of Jesus because of my influence. Let's just say you're saying that with humility and all the right
Yeah,
motivations. Okay, that's a big number.
yeah,
I would say your chances of doing it through multi-site are very, very slim because you're going to have to be, again, a Greg Rochelle or a David Ashcraft, and there's just not a lot of those people out there. So what I would say is, if you will start just multiplying disciples and multiplying leaders, and you keep giving them permission to do whatever they can do, I would have and I have tremendous confidence that you could get there through that, and then through planning and releasing those churches to do whatever it is that God meant for them to do. Does that make
yeah,
sense?
yeah, totally.
Because um, the operations behind 100,000 person multi-site church is there's just a lot of machinery there.
Yeah.
But 100,000 people, and I've seen this happen through church planning, you really just have to be good at one thing, and that's developing leaders and blessing them and say, go get them.
Yeah. So you know what I'm taking away from this, Dave, is I think oftentimes we ask the wrong question. And in our cohorts all the time, multi-sites are talked about, and the question seems to always be, should I or should I not be going multi-site? And probably that's the wrong question to ask. The question is, should I or should I not be multiplying? And the answer is yes, we should all be multipliers. And so then in what way are we going to multiply is probably the better question to be asking.
100%. In fact, chapter 2 and 3 in Hero Maker, we talk about asking the right question. Here's the question I think most church leaders ask. I think they ask the question, how can I grow my church?
Hmm.
Which I would say is a good question. It's just not a great question. It's a good question because it comes from a good place, and I think, but it's still a kind of a castle building question. How do I grow my church? I think, and maybe this would work in your cohorts, how do we, again, because you got these people working together, how do we multiply? Multiply is better than grow. You're going to get a lot more people, reach a lot more. How do we multiply God's kingdom?
Yeah.
And when you ask that question, I mean, all of a sudden the roof comes off and you're going, oh man, we multiply God's kingdom. And I mean, there's a lot more possibilities out there than how can I grow my church?
Yeah. And I will say for us at LCBC, what really opened it up for us, Dave, Chick-fil-A, used to say, and maybe still do all the time, their business is getting chicken to the people. And we came away from listening to them saying our job is really to get Jesus to the people.
Yep.
And then the next influence was the Marriott Corporation, 30 different brands, but all Marriotts. And we used to think we needed LCBC on the side of all the buildings. And we realized it doesn't matter what name is on the side of the building, is Jesus being taken to the people. That's what matters, which caused us then to say, okay, it's not about us. It's not about LCBC. It's about, to your point, building the
Yeah.
kingdom. And so let's multiply in that regard. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Well
no,
done.
that's great. Yeah,
Well
that's really
done.
good. You guys always talk about at Exponential, is it the 16%? Is that the number you use? And so
Yeah.
describe that
Right.
real quick.
Yeah. I think it was a guy named Everett Rogers. I don't know if he was the original one with the innovation curve, but later on, Malcolm Gladwell kind of made it popularized it. We call it about the tipping point.
Yeah,
And when you get a certain number of people who are engaged in a certain activity, it'll influence the whole. And that sociological tipping point is really at 16%. And I remember a conversation with Tim Keller, and Tim talked about if I can get a certain number of people in New York that become Christ followers, it'll influence the whole.
yeah,
And even before that was Chuck Colson with prison ministry said, I know in a prison, if I can get this percentage of the inmates, those that are incarcerated, to really be followers of Jesus, it'll influence the whole prison population. And so when we talk about the 16% mission, we want to see 16% of all churches become reproducing or multiplying. And we define that if ever start another site or ever plant another church, that would be level 4, that's reproducing, or level 5, multiplying, where you see 4 generations of multiplication. And so we want to see 16% or more of the church in the United States do that. And we think that's a tipping point that could really influence all of culture across America if that happened for Jesus.
yeah. That's very cool. And is that happening? Are you seeing movement towards that 16%?
From 2015 to today, we've seen the needle move from 4% to 7%.
Okay.
So there is movement, but we still got a long ways to go.
Yeah. Okay. And so just one last question, Dave, maybe as we
Yeah.
wrap up. How do you even move the dial? So if it's taken that long to get it from 6 to 7%,
From 4 to 7, but yes.
yeah. So is it totally a God thing, or are there things that we can be doing other than just challenging each other to be multipliers? And
Well, I mean, I do think it starts with every individual Christ follower, and particularly the people listening to our conversation right now as pastors. They have to. You're going to reproduce who you are, and if you want to have a multiplying church, you need to be a multiplier. You
right,
need. You ought to be able to name. Here's the people that I'm investing in to become a leader, or here's the person I'm investing who's going to become a church planter. There ought to be actual. You ought to be able to name those people, and if you will do that, it'll work its way into your stories. It'll work its way into you'll have the culture. And
right.
we estimate, based on the number of churches that are across the country, if we had 60,000 churches that were led by multipliers, that would change the whole.
Okay.
And so currently, we're at a little less than half of that. So we're probably around, 25 to 27,000 churches that there are in some way multiplying, but we got to get to 60. And it does. I mean, conversation we're having here, if everybody there in Pennsylvania, the church leaders took that seriously, I mean, that'd be a game changer.
Yeah, definitely. That's cool. Dave, it's fun to talk to you. I appreciate you taking time with us. And if people wanted to find out more about what you're doing, just go Google Exponential new thing, or is there a better
Yeah.
way to do that?
I mean, I have a website too, daveferguson.org, but all of the stuff about new things at newthing.org, all the stuff about exponentials at exponential.org. And yeah, we'd love to have you come be a part of what we're doing or come experience what we're doing.
That's great. Well, definitely you're making an impact and you are influencing people in a very positive way. So fun to see that and appreciate the relationship. So, Dave, thanks for time with us today. Appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me. And I want everybody there to know I'm super grateful for you, David, for what you're doing through the Global Leadership Summit, what you've done in the past through LCBC. Really, I mean, well done. And thanks for your friendship.
Yeah. Thanks, Dave. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Advantage Podcast with David Ashcraft and for participating in our goal to strengthen and encourage pastors and their churches so more people are introduced to Jesus across Pennsylvania. If you found this helpful, feel free to pass it along. To find out more about the work of The Advantage, visit our website at theadvantage.org.